the obstructions, such as with the Portland mission, which then they having forced, according to the secret order, using the secret equipment, to have sent David from where he was going to be into Portland for a time, would have, at the very beginning, restored the right of the work schedule as well as the rest of it from the point of origin at that release from the change of jurisdictions, or they wouldn't have done it at all, as is derivative by their objective to have conducted the murder by the war of attrition, and therefore selling it or laundering it down to the lower degrees of the insurgent white supremacist communist insurrection, who are using the restraints for the purposes of the centrally planned economy. As the communists determine who gets to do what profession and therefore what resources they also get to determine all other aspects of life, and to do other aspects of life, such as the determination of the free will over one's own body in order to choose what they want to do with their bodies, such as with relationships and pregnancies and so forth. And they would have to have the freedom, such as from the Constitution, to do so. And under the communists, they would not, as they are property of the communists, and therefore their lives and sex are property of the communists, and therefore the activity of having sex with somebody outside of your register, according to the communists, would be theft from the communists, as they have stolen you in a kidnapping operation and view you as property and therefore can do whatever they want, including various abusive experiments, such as acid in your face as a retaliation for your noncompliance, or theft or contempt for the Communist Party as a counter-revolutionary. This, as a foundational objective, materializes the function of those actions, at which point whatever Congress would have wanted David to have done, having to have been a secret from the intelligence community being actively entangled into the operation, would have not been an independent contractor and therefore does not have control over it, as they control the schedule, and therefore whatever has to happen under their full control, under their meticulous and manipulative objectives, according to their own inherent objectives, which are classified. This then produces the objective of acquiring the free market, which they would have had to have paid from the very beginning in the change, which requires them to have returned the things seized, which they don't want to pay, and therefore they would have to pay the support essentials to the funding of the return of the original assessments, which they did not want to do as an attachment to the confession to having taken the rest of it, as they protect their crimes as communists who hate the United States, have confessed to their insurrection and disloyalty to the nation by virtue of the corruption, where they continued the abuse of restraints and amplified the abuse for their power fetishes, asserting dominance through that mechanism. Alternatively, they could have restored it, such as, but is not limited to, the function of the restoration of David's bank. And David's bank creates David's credit cards from his bank, which then sells it like other credit cards, like MasterCard and American Express and Visa and the rest of them, its own brand, and therefore the mechanism of whatever he would call it is irrelevant, as the system relies on it as a mechanism. They then releasing the sober educated answer from the obstructed thing already have the details in that system where it could be released and then verified according to the support networks owed in that system, at which point it, in its full restoration, can engage in those calculations and then summarize those actions. This would then be, as a foundation, the first service being restored, as that action allows them to engage in the rest of the calculations essential to understand of what was happening, as the objective of the communists is the starvation by a war of attrition, and therefore the restraints of work, and therefore the gainful employment, which then funds all of the things, which, and that respect would specifically allow David, in the release from that, to no longer be subject to those abuses, returning to those works of essential faculties. This would then allow for the rest of the services, which should, in this regard specifically, in this limited capacity, remain slightly aloof. And since it's slightly aloof, we can address it at another time. But suffice to say, the function would have substantively had the proper resources, which would have exponentially increased his status and living conditions, as is observant by those looking from the outside, not understanding the systems, as is essential in the Antichrist ritual, as the Antichrist is supposed to be hidden and not seen, and therefore hidden, and therefore a surprise to everyone, and therefore when they release the Antichrist, he, in all of his actual material value, can be seen, and everyone will say how surprised they are that he was able to accomplish such extraordinary accelerations, which could only be explained by the suppression, and therefore the spring of having suppressed so hard is then exponentially accelerating at that point, which is fundamental to the occultist entanglements with the satanic religion of the white supremacist communists, who, engaging in the war of suppression, war of attrition in order to acquire these rituals, materialize their murder by starvation techniques, which then allows for the release of the title and their backup values, which then exponentially accelerates the target, which is the actual material problem that they're having in this specific dilemma. And seeing as how the contract schedule being released in order to engage in that material apparatus would have at its various specific orientations the ability to have easily collected 20 to 40 grands within a short period of time, which easily covers all of the basic costs for the extended period of time before any essential upgrades would be derivative of other opportunities from the contracts, if so released in some kind of capitalist society, as though this was America or something, like we were some kind of rule of law society, as opposed to the thing that we are compelled and tormented into enduring under the white supremacist Communist Party. As the zombie insurance would actively have to have been restored at its foundation, materially engaging in the proper risk management systems would have to fund immediately the fullest extent of that security. This then would fully utilize the available amenities as is derivative for that objective, as the employment systematically increases exponentially, fundamentally in its point of origin, in many cases at a loss, as is derivative of most companies, as the startups of most companies fail because the profits generically do not come in until the seventh year of being more valuable than what they put into it, as the delay from the stagnant consistency is essential, and therefore those who do not have the endurance are often the failures or the general statistic. This not being relevant to that structure materializes the exponential investments into it and is not deterred by its existence and therefore actively subsidized by the other sources of income and investments, which, secondary to the long-term investments, materialize their immediate refreshing. To this extent, they not doing that would not have poisoned him in the very beginning or engaged in any of subversive techniques, such as one of their tactics which they had threatened him with earlier in his life as a teenager, saying that if they wanted to compete with somebody like with the coffee house, they would put bed bugs or some subversive thing inside of the furniture, in which case they, polluting the area, make it contaminated and actively scare them off. This technique, not being applied if the Americans had been in control, would not have the subversive abuses in the batteries derivative of the degrowth terrorist operations from the white supremacist communists, which these not being suffered, materialize the stability essential to the proper development of the businesses, as the sabotages not being available include its restoration, and therefore not its sabotage, and therefore its stable successes without the illusion derivative of their objective in order to control the market by their batteries as the Neo-KKK. To disregard the development of those systems fundamentally being understood by David's education would have had to have restored the brokerage that David would have already maintained, and therefore its restoration requires this immediate material capability, and therefore the release of the contracts funding its restoration allows for the simultaneous engagements as long-term investments, which then allows for the education to be applied to the general economic groups inside the society who would then be restored to the accounts as his clients, who then would actively be advised concerning their businesses in the amplification as additional amenities derivative of them as clients, which then facilitates the stability of the general market by the superior education that they are obstructing in order to maintain the manipulation in their traumatization of the general abuses by that and other techniques, which would then subvert it, protected by the zombie insurance, which would then allow for their long-term endurance and stability derivative as his clients and therefore the benefactor of those amenities, which then would actively sustain the long-term economic growth, which by definition is a part of a long, hard-fought economic stability, as the function of the long-term investment isn't going to pay off in a very long time. Its long-term existence, therefore, becomes the premier subject, as it is subsidized by the other, more actively liquid resources. And this continuing the function exponentially requires the function of the restoration of the speech, as David Foundation Incorporated would be resurrected earlier, as it having been existent from the point of his before he was born, was seized and in the takings and then not paid for in the takings, and therefore was already under their understanding in order to obstruct it, and therefore its restoration in that position allows for the nonprofit charity to engage in the exponential investment in the impartial fundings of independent journalism for its impartial position, which, according to David's original position as a political power broker, would have by definition been impartial in order to serve the various parties in its hyperacceleration, and therefore partiality to one party or another would actively subvert his client list. And to this extent, that financial motive exponentially increases this position, as it is a support structure for the other network interests, as the exponential increase of those potentials create the viabilities of the other services' exponential growth at the point of origin as its release, and therefore the spring from the release, like a jack-in-the-box, exponentially accelerates the thing at a hyper-accelerated rate, and therefore the function of proving the tactics of the creation of the Antichrist by that very same technique, if you needed a specific example. Pop goes the weasel in this obstruction of contracts as a retaliation for unlawful firings by the anti-Congress. As the brokerage would exponentially specialize in the various attachments, it having been restored to those original positions, require the government to have restored the obstructed value so that it could conduct its work without the sabotage in the free market, as is its right and responsibility. And therefore, the restoration of those essential resources materialized the ability to have traded the essential resources in order to have maximized the network interest, crafting the path of the contract schedule, or maximum returns at the lowest risk path, which then materializes the exponential diversification to those seeking particular accelerations as subordinate aspects, which then could attempt more daring positions in order to gain their promotions independent of the thing, which then would be provided as a benefit through that structure, which would then allow them to accelerate to those positions as their BCS score exponentially increases, increasing their credit score, allowing them to subsidize their position in their financial endowments from those entanglements, allowing them to receive their promotions and increases of wages as independent contractors, separate to any of David's structures and therefore risk. But they, being subject as clients to David, materialize the function of the full benefit of the insurance in case of the failure, which then, as an alternative subsidy, materializes the ability to have attempted and attempted and attempted until they succeed at their various goals, as long as they have the endurance to acquire it. Now, these various investigations have the obstructed uses of those who have been taking David's money from the accounts according to the credit cards as the mechanism of them having used the surveillance equipment in order to steal his money, even if it is for the purposes of wasting it, would by definition be their charge of their independent credit card. So, David starts a bank. That bank starts a credit card. They purchase their credit card. That credit card is attached to a money account, and that money is spent by them wasting it on the credit card, and they, seeking to cheat him, want to not pay off that credit card, and therefore don't pay off that credit card, and therefore are in exponential debts, and they, having done so from the investigation, are discovered and put into the account as the thing is restored to its appropriate place, and they, with their outstanding debts, are sent the bill appropriately, as is registered in normal according to state and federal government law, and having been acknowledged by the state and federal government, has attached it to all of the necessary didgeridoos, which they, continuing to not want to do it, engages in the exponential legal battles as the mechanism of the resurrection of David's legion of lawyers materializes the function for the support of these obstructed values, becoming a sinkhole of money exponentially, drying up those liquid resources which would have otherwise been in excess, which is fine and appropriate and normal to the economy. This is irrelevant to the function outside of the action of it being an exponential burden to reacquire the resources taken from those who sought the attempted theft and its compounding liabilities and insurances derivative of their financial incompetence, and that financial incompetence exponentially being accelerated and supported and crafted by the cult of the white supremacist Communist Party, have at their core identity the objective of the armed robbery. Now, this, as a generic understanding, has facilitated insurgents in order to sabotage these values from their double agents, including but not limited to the false apparatus of the connections to lawyers who, having greater knowledge of the case, have meticulously worked as a double agent, having been compromised for the purposes as a spy for the adversaries, would then exponentially have full and competent knowledge of this, refusing to file or do the proper works naturally associated with it for the express derived outcome of its outrageous failures, therefore obstructing the rest of the lawyers from engaging in it, double checking the work, as the function of a lawyer's derived by the payment from their accomplished mission. The longer it takes, the exponential worse it is on the victim, and therefore the cheaper it is for everyone to get it done quickly is the higher goal. which is actively being delayed by those who are paid off for the alternative resources as a double agent, receiving payments from the adversary for the strategic action of the war, enforced by the Marxist insurrection, which, having subsidized them, allows them to ignore the benefits of having received the normal profits derived by their direct public observed service. Their dereliction is on purpose and not a mistake, as their participation in the various occult rituals include the murders derived by David's absence, materializes the ongoing obstructions for the purposes of protecting the damages and the threats, such as the Lahaina fires or the LA fires and so forth. They, having been predicted exponentially from those systems, required David in order to engage in the subversion of the risk, allowing it to be managed, which requires the restraints and undermining of him for the active vulnerabilities as a self-inflicted wound derived by its components, who, having been a lower degree of the 33 degree or other systems derived by the illusions in order to engage in the act of sacrifices from their occult loyalties, materialize their intentional vulnerability so that they can receive the injury as a sacrifice for their occult for the Marxist white supremacist revolution. And having sold their soul lie for the Communist Party exponentially, and having divided themselves to the various devils, materialized the delusional position for their hyper-accelerated position in society, as is derived by the Communist Party and its hate crimes, degrowing the competition as they accept the acceleration from the communists, who are removing the competition, allowing them for the viability in that position that they've been centrally planned for as a gift of the Communist Party, as they accept the vulnerabilities inherent and subject to the function of this deal with the devil, and the controlled environment from this arrangement of those suicidal complements materialize to the culmination of inconveniences until everyone complies with their place in the communist centrally planned economy, having been subject exponentially to the tormenting positions of the entrapments, which become the status quo function of society as you are beaten into compliance, as the communists do not trade money. The communists trade people, as all are held in common.